Philip Lowe uses his final speech as Reserve Bank Governor to call for a fix on housing affordability and productivity. The financial services regulator sues PayPal, and the nation's housing market has surpassed $10 trillion in value as prices go up again. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Friday, the 8th of September 2023. I'm Michael Thompson, and Sean Aylmer is still on holiday, so I am joined once again by Jennifer Duke. Jen, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Gosh, Sean's having a good holiday, isn't he?
I'm very jealous.
Yeah, look, I say I'm happy for him, but those comments are tinged by jealousy as well. Now, immediately after the show, Jen, you have a really interesting interview coming up with Shannon Nutter, who is the head of Vanguard Super. Now, Vanguard is a major investment manager around the world with, I think, something like $12 trillion in assets under management. So it is well worth listening to what they say.
So we were having this great chat about the gender gap in superannuation, why women are often so hesitant to seek advice, and what people can do right now to ensure they have a better financial future.
Yeah, it is well worth sticking around for. The interview is coming up a little bit later on. The main story this morning, though, Jen, is a ripper. Philip Lowe has delivered his last speech as Reserve Bank Governor, and he used it to warn that it will be difficult to return to a world and an economy that we had pre-pandemic. And he's urged society and politicians to address housing affordability. It was a pretty kind of wide-ranging speech, wasn't it?
It was a really good speech. So he was saying that Australia has some of the highest housing costs in the world, but not because of interest rates and not because of the Reserve Bank, but because even though low interest rates have contributed to rising prices, it's more the choices that we've made as a society that are keeping house prices high. So he reckons that it's urban planning, transport systems, and the way that we tax housing and land that are among the reasons our homes are so expensive. And he called it a serious economic and social problem.
I like the fact that, it's clearly his last speech, so he's just kind of really speaking his mind on a number of issues. He's had a tough couple of years facing a lot of attacks in the media and in politics as well, because the Reserve Bank's central case for rates, that they would remain at record lows until 2024, was wrong. What did he have to say, if anything, about that particular, I suppose you'd say, fairly tricky period?
Well, he kind of threw down the gauntlet on this one. He said that he knows some of his explanations have missed the mark. I think we'd all agree with that. But he also used his speech to hit out at the media. So in particular, he was disputing headlines. I don't know if you remember them, but there were several of these sorts of articles that claimed he'd made a promise that rates wouldn't go up, which is right. He never actually promised it. It was a forecast. He also said that he didn't make other points that were attributed to him. So that's things like everyone should get a flatmate, people should have to work more hours to make ends meet, or that young people should stay home to save cash because of the rental crisis. And he reflected on the difficulties of communicating in the social media and digital age as well.
Yeah, we actually spoke on Fear and Greed about a speech this week from European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde, who had a very similar reflection about the difficulties that she's facing in communicating with the public in a really volatile time.
Yeah, we did. And look, trust is a really fragile thing, and it's even harder to hold on to when uncertainty means that predictions are often wrong. And central banks globally are really alert to this at the moment. But Dr. Lowe said that the media also has a responsibility here, and we need facts, nuance, and informed debate rather than vitriol and clickbait, which is what he thinks he's experienced. And that feels like a pretty reasonable ask, to be honest.
Wow. You are, in your day job, the economics correspondent for Capital Brief. Was there anything else that stood out to you from this speech? I'm actually quite surprised at how open and really quite upfront he was about his true thoughts on what was a fairly rough period.
It's pretty refreshing that he was willing to speak so openly. And I was particularly struck by Dr. Lowe's reflections on where we're headed as a nation. So he said it's going to be difficult for us to return to that world that we used to have, where inflation was in a very narrow range. We all remember sort of pre-pandemic days when inflation wasn't really doing very much at all. And now we're looking at a future that has way more supply shocks in it. So deglobalization, climate change, this major energy transition that we're always talking about, and a shift in our demographics. We're all getting a bit older. So what that means is that we're going to have a more volatile economy and more volatile inflation. And he also raised the big issue of productivity and the need for reform in this space, which I thought was really important. I can't help but agree with his comments on this one, because the issue here isn't a lack of ideas, but the need to build consensus for change. It's really a political problem. And Dr. Lowe's warning that if governments aren't up to the task, then all of our living standards will suffer as a result.
All right. What a pretty solid way to go out, I suppose.
Big speech. Very long time in the RBA. I think we've got to hand it to him on that one.
Yeah, indeed. All right. How did local markets perform yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 closed down 1.2% to 7171 points after one of the weakest trading days we've seen for weeks. So there were declines across the board. Every sector fell over the day. Metals and mining and materials were leading the falls. Lower iron ore prices were having a significant effect there. And real estate investment trusts, communication services and utilities held up best, though they still fell. The best of the day was Liontown Resources, up 9%, followed by Chalice Mining, up 7.9%. And the worst performer was Super Retail Group, which fell 7.6%.
And what's happening in international markets?
So in China, exports fell 8.8% in August year on year, which marks a significant downturn. And it's adding to concerns about China's economy overall. Imports contracted 7.3%, but that was a little less than expected. Over in the US, the Federal Reserve has published data showing economic growth was modest in July and August, and price growth is slowing and the labour market is too, and there's still some hard landing risks there.
Now, tell me, Jen, there's so much happening at the moment with tech tensions internationally right now.
There are. So it's about Apple right now. So Apple's facing some really big turbulence because they've got a big event next week launching a new line of iPhones. But the Wall Street Journal is actually reporting that China's telling officials at central government agencies not to use those iPhones. But over in the US, the Financial Times is reporting that the White House has asked for detailed information about Huawei's latest smartphone and the chips that it uses. So the US put an export restriction on Chinese chip maker CIMIC 3 years ago due to what it said was an unacceptable risk of its tech being used for military use. So it is a bit of a tech war.
Yeah, it certainly is. So essentially you've got China kind of doubting Apple's iPhones. You've got the US doubting China's Huawei phones.
We need like a neutral country to start producing smartphones.
Yeah, like a Swiss phone.
That's right.
Swiss phone. And it's one of the, it's like a phone that does a whole bunch of other things. It's got a little corkscrew and everything in there as well, just like your general Swiss Army knife, but a phone instead.
That would be amazing, actually.
We are an ideas factory here at Fear and Greed. Jen, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Jen, the Australian Bureau of Statistics is now publishing separate quarterly data about the number of multiple job holders. And this is really interesting stuff because the numbers are quite substantial. There were 950,000 people working more than one job in March.
Yeah, that was actually up by 20,000 people in just 3 months. So it's now 6.6% of the workforce who have more than one job. Young people are more likely to do this. I think that isn't really surprising to anyone, but women are as well. And 1 in 10 community and personal services workers has a side job. So some of this might be gig work. We've heard a lot about that this week, but it's also part-time work as well. And in fact, where single job holders usually work about 35 and a half hours a week on average, multiple job holders are working about 40 and a half hours. Some of this rise could be due to more flexible work post-pandemic. Some of it might be more digital jobs available, but it could also be families trying to make ends meet right now.
Yeah, I suppose you really can't discount the cost of living crisis when you look at this data. Now, Jen, I mentioned this one at the top of the show. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission has sued PayPal. It's alleging that PayPal was unfair in its contracts with small businesses.
So PayPal gives business account holders 60 days to let them know of any problems like errors or discrepancies in their fees. And if they don't tell them within that time frame, then under the contract terms as they currently stand, the business has to wear the cost. So even if they find out after the fact that it's wrong and they've paid way too much, they still have to pay. So ASIC alleges that this is unfair because it allows PayPal to retain overcharged or wrongly charged fees. ASIC says the term is an imbalance in the parties' rights and obligations, isn't really reasonably necessary, and would cause detriment to business account holders. The regulator wants declarations that the term is void, injunctions and corrective orders and things like that. PayPal Australia told Reuters that it had been working in full cooperation with ASIC and took the matter seriously, and it's reviewing the claims.
Meanwhile, the competition watchdog, Jen, is suing eHarmony, of all things, which is one of the nation's most used dating apps.
Doesn't feel very harmonious, does it, to do that?
No, it really doesn't. It should be called eConflict.
eConflict. Oh, so the ACCC is alleging that eHarmony misrepresented itself for having free dating, where members could only see blurry pictures of other members as part of the unpaid basic subscriptions. It's a little bit more like blind dating, I guess. And the ACCC alleges that the company breached consumer law with statements about pricing, renewal, and membership duration. Apparently, they had hundreds of people complaining about the dating app. The competition watchdog is also alleging that the membership renewal is a subscription trap.
All right, away from eHarmony now to a different kind of relationship. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has met with China's premier on the sidelines of the East Asia Summit.
So the Prime Minister described the meeting as a frank and constructive discussion. That's a direct quote. And the statement from his office says that they welcome progress in stabilising the relationship between Australia and China and agreed there was value in expanding cooperation in areas of shared interest. Now, Albanese said he raised a range of issues with the Premier, including the remaining trade impediments, so we all know there's stuff still on wine, consular cases, and human rights issues. And he's set to visit China later this year. That's actually 50 years after Gough Whitlam travelled there himself, which was the first ever visit from an Australian Prime Minister to China. And it marked kind of a major shift of diplomatic relations. It's kind of an interesting time.
Yeah, very significant milestone, isn't it? Now, speaking of big milestones, and I love the way these stories today just flow from one to the next.
So many milestones.
Yeah, that's right. Big milestone here for Australia's housing market. It hit $10 trillion in value at the end of August. That's on the latest CoreLogic data, which values the median home across the country at just about $730,000.
Which is a huge figure. Look, we have passed this milestone before, but house prices fell back, and this marks the first time since June last year that we've hit it again. And with home values rising between March and August by just under 5%, we've actually clawed back about half of the loss already from the downturn. So CoreLogic is saying that migration, relatively low number of people living in each home, and people using savings and equity to buy more properties has contributed to the climb. Plus, supply is just still too low, really. Our national housing stock has increased to about 11 million properties, but CoreLogic isn't convinced the market is going to keep growing at this pace. We're yet to see how the impact of higher interest rates plays out.
Yeah, and Jen, we're expecting a big weekend of auctions too coming up by the looks of it. Activity up for the 5th consecutive week.
Yeah, it's going to be another big one, to be honest. There are 2,357 homes currently scheduled for auction, and that compares to about 1,918 last year. And last weekend, there were about 2,286, so it's a huge one. Melbourne is having its 3rd week above 1,000, and Sydney is having its busiest weekend since Easter.
Okay, now Bunnings, Jen, is expanding into the prefabricated home building space as the skills shortage, the rising cost of labour and the challenged construction market really changes the dynamics of home building.
Yeah, we all love a Bunnings story. Bunnings is going to be making and delivering prefabricated walls, roof trusses, and other parts of houses to sell to time-poor tradies. So they've already made investments in this space worth about $75 million, that's over the past 2 years, into 3 additional automated plants. And Bunnings clearly sees itself as taking on a significant role in the giant home building industry. And that is at a time, as you alluded to, when construction companies are going bust and there's this huge shortage of skilled tradies. And we know the government is very eager to drive up home building across the country. So Bunnings' new prefab products can actually be used for properties as varied as houses, townhouses, and even low-rise apartments. So it could be a really big market play for them in the long term.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating one to watch. Now, South Korean companies are preparing to sue Australian miners and laboratory business ALS over fake coal testing allegations.
So Korea Midland Power told the Australian Financial Review that a lawsuit is on its way, and that's following revelations that the test results of Aussie coal set aside for export were manipulated. ALS admitted in 2020 that up to half of its results on certificates from its coal testing arm had been manually changed, and that was without justification for over a decade. So the quality was allegedly lifted for when it was coal that was going to be burned in power stations. Some South Korean power companies actually banned ALS from testing during that time. And the level of damages being claimed is still yet to be determined. And the ALS actually told the AFR it hasn't received any notice of legal proceedings quite yet.
Okay, let's turn to international news now. And over in Spain, Jen, there's been a surprise spate of thefts of all things, olive oil.
Yeah, the olive oil industry is under serious pressure in Spain at the moment. So the prices of the oil jumped to record highs in the middle of a serious drought recently. And that in turn is making it more of a target for organised crime. And Bloomberg reports that in August, about 50,000 litres worth, that's 500,000 euros worth of olive oil, was nicked from a mill in Spain. And this is just one of a wave of olive oil crimes that's threatening to push prices even higher. There was a 29% jump in thefts of just pure olives in one Spanish region during the 22-23 season, and there has been a rise in groups faking olive oil. So it's a reminder of the knock-on effects of climate change and volatile prices.
Now, how about this one? A new deal between Universal Music and French streaming service Deezer possibly marks the biggest shift for musicians' earnings since Spotify took hold.
So the two companies are aiming to put more cash back in the hands of professional artists, and they define that as those with 1,000 listens a month minimum on the platform. Those who reach this threshold get double when calculating royalties. And if someone's actively looking up a musician, it lifts their royalties again. So that would actually mark a double-digit rise in payouts to musicians compared to what they currently get. And I was particularly taken by the explanation from Deezer CEO Geronimo Folguera, who was reported by the Financial Times as explaining it like this. They have 90 million tracks on their service, but some of them are literally just noise, and not the noise that I would call it, like music that I don't like, but literally noise, the sound of rain or the sound of a washing machine. And he doesn't think that those tracks should bring in the same amount for a creator as, say, Harry Styles gets for putting his songs on there. This could also improve the service by reducing the cash going to bots, white noise producers, and amateurs.
So it sounds like actually quite a progressive deal.
It's actually nice to see creators and, artists getting more cash back for once and not just being about the business's bottom line.
Yeah, it's a good story. Now, finally, Google is going to force advertisers to disclose when election campaign advertisements are inauthentically, and that's a quote, depicting people or events, such as, for example, I suppose, when they use AI.
So Google is trying to combat the problem of digitally manipulated content for political gain. So it wants advertisers, particularly the verified ones, to tell people if it makes it look like someone did or say something that didn't really happen. And this is going to kick in during November, which is a way ahead of the 2024 US election. So there's some time to kind of work out the kinks. Actually, next week, which is kind of interesting timing, Google's CEO is actually going to be alongside the Microsoft boss and former boss Bill Gates at an AI forum in Washington. And the Financial Times thinks that this will be the foundation of new legislation on AI in the US. It's being hosted by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg will apparently be attending too. So there've already been cases of people using AI to recreate voices and images of politicians and celebrities, particularly in the US, for content. And people are often pretty much deceived by them. So this feels like a good step.
That is going to be a big event next week.
Yes, it is. I'm sure we'll be talking all about it.
Oh, I'm sure we will be. Okay, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview. You are speaking today with Shannon Nutter, the head of Vanguard Super.
Yeah, she also has some excellent suggestions for what government could be doing and what businesses can do themselves to help women and fix that gender retirement gap.
Yeah, some of those statistics are really quite confronting that she goes through, just how big that gap is and how it's not just the gap in the superannuation balance, but there's a whole bunch of other problems that need to be fixed along the way. So it is definitely worth sticking around for. It's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And as well, don't forget to check out that new episode of How Do They Afford That, which came out on Wednesday, all about saving and investing for education. Thank you very much, Jen.
Thanks so much, Michael.
It is Friday, the 8th of September, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.